So welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to today's symposium on Chinese modernity in German Jewish thought. My name is Julia Ng. I am reader in critical theory at Goldsmiths, and I'm the organizer of today's event. And before we begin, I'd like to first thank Royal Holloway's Center for Continental Philosophy and the Department of Politics, International Relations, and Philosophy, and especially Professor Nathan Witter, who's sitting right here, for helping me and set things up and generously providing us with a room that we're in right now. I also want to thank the British Academy for its support it is providing through its mid-career fellowship, which is for my broader research project, of which today's event is the second of 3 public conferences. And as a way of introducing today's discussion, I want to briefly present this overall project before turning to the specific themes that we'll be exploring in greater detail today. And apologies in advance for those of you who were here last time. Some of it, just the first bit, is going to be a little bit of a recap of what I said last time, but in the first conference. So anyway, the project I'm working on is entitled Daoism and Capitalism, and it takes its original inspiration from a conference that I organized in 2015, at which one of our speakers, Dr. Daniel Weiss, was also a participant, so sitting over there. The paper that I gave at that conference, which has since been published in Theory, Culture, and Society, centered around a little-known critical altercation, one in which Walter Benjamin defines capitalism as a religion, as a rejoinder to Max Weber, not his Protestant ethics and the spirit of capitalism, however, but to its sequel, Confucianism and Daoism, in which Weber argues that these are states of irrationality that, unlike Calvinism in Europe, will never give rise to an indigenous capitalism. For Weber, the religious condition in China lacked the despair that might inspire a creative impulse to dominate over nature and transform the world. In it, any action is therefore non-productive, non-competitive, and lies outside of the time of capital, a situation that Weber interprets as a structural underpinning of political economy, on the basis of which he then distinguishes between European and non-European ideal types. And for Weber, who ignores the instances of ethical rationality evidenced by centuries of millenarian movements associated with Taoist sects, the non-productive individual, without a vocation, simply falls outside of history. Now, for Benjamin, on the other hand, capitalism itself has the features of a religion, and so it might take root anywhere its essence might be found. And as this is merely wherever one incurs a debt, takes blame, and thereby enters the moral sphere of guilt, the history of capitalism thus only happens to look like Christianity in Europe, as demonstrated for Benjamin by the fact that non-productive individuals are evidently also drawn into capitalism's fate as well, whether the domestic or the global economy. And from this, Benjamin draws a conclusion that would issue into one of the primary insights of the early Frankfurt School. The mythic structures that underpin political economy do not therefore distinguish between European and non-European ideal types, but themselves contain and make legible epoch-ending social historical transformations. Now, what's striking is that Benjamin was also preoccupied with Daoism beyond that one fragment from 1921. And from his earliest writings on the metaphysics of youth to his essays on Franz Kafka, Bertolt Brecht, and the artwork in the Age of Mechanical Reproducibility in the 1930s, Benjamin repeatedly turned to concepts of non-productivity and non-action that he attributed to Daoism. A second striking thing is that the image of Daoism that emerges from Benjamin's writings is associated with a mode of political economic activity, that as activity is therefore not reducible to the passivity, quietism, or ineffectual magic typically associated with Daoism in Orientalist reception. Moreover, there was a pattern of treating Taoist themes as seeds of a critical social theory amongst German Jewish thinkers and those adjacent to them in Benjamin's milieu, including Franz Rosenzweig, Martin Buber, Kafka and Brecht, Ernst Bloch, and even Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. They also cross-referenced each other. Buber's translation of the Zhuangzi from 1910, for example, partly inspired Franz Rosenzweig's discussion of the Tao in The Star of Redemption, on which Benjamin in turn comments in his Kafka essay of 1934. This brings me to the topic of today, the specific affinity between modern German Jewish thought and what it considered to be the Orient, and how, within the concept of contemporaneous Asia, and especially China, This affinity related to German Jewish thinkers' critical altercation with their own modernity and contemporaneity. Around 1900, this affinity would have been sought against competing notions of the Orient and the Asiatic. Anti-Semitic discourse had already sometimes applied the term Oriental to Jews in order to mark them as unassumably alien. For instance, Herder, who around 1800 described the Jews as the foreign Asiatic people in what he called our part of the world. Others after him also supplemented this picture of alien unassimilability with the notions that Jews and Asians alike were nomadic cultures, rootless. Then there was a Dionysiac version of the Oriental. For instance, a novel from 1900 by Richard Hoffmann, a Viennese writer, depicts its protagonist's rediscovery of his Jewish identity as an emotional journey towards reconnection with a primordial, physical, yet sophisticated kind of Oriental religiosity, a picture probably construed under the influence of Nietzscheanism. There was also a mythic Judaic variation on the Oriental Jew, namely the discovery of the Kaifeng Jews, a purportedly historical community of Jews living in the northern Chinese city of Kaifeng, who, according to that account, had arrived in China in the 2nd century BCE during the Han Dynasty. This story, in turn, tended to be recounted as historical fact in a variety of venues, including in the German and Austrian newspapers, whose reporting on China was intensifying in tandem with the beginnings of the German colonial enterprise from the 1890 onwards, and particularly as the German Empire occupied Kiaochao Bay in 1897 and its troops instigated the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. In the midst of the news about contemporaneous China, the millennia-long existence of the Kaifeng Jews was cited as a contrasting example to the Jewish suffering in Europe, to cast China, on the other hand, as a welcoming abode that was somehow that was devoid of anti-Semites. And this image of China as welcoming to all religions, which was the inverse picture of the European picture of China's despotism as opposed to its own enlightenment, was also then supplemented by reporting on the successful Jewish families living in Shanghai and Hong Kong, the Sassoons, the Kadoris, and also the broader Sephardic community in Shanghai, for instance. These reports on the contemporaneous diaspora, one has to note, did not make particular mention of the fact that some of that Jewish diaspora in the Far East had established there as part of the European and especially British colonial expansion from India to the coast of China. Alias David Sassoon, for example, first arrived in Shanghai in 1850 to trade in opium and textiles. So it must be said that this description of China as philo-Semitic abode was an idealized picture also of a domain for Jewish existence as uninvolved in European colonial and imperial ambitions as it was devoid of the anti-Semitism found in European states, even if materially, as it were, that picture partly also profited from participation in European colonialism. Thus, for instance, we see Theodor Herzl's brand of Zionism, according to whose Der Judenstaat, Jews would construct a European society outside of Europe that would, quote, form a part of the rampart against Asia and serve as, quote, an outpost of culture against barbarism. That is, Jews who are fully unassimilable to host culture, though here too their refuge is pictured as a well-defined existence that contrasts with the colony whose possibility is not considered. In contrast to that, of course, we have Martin Buber's version of Zionism. In contrast to Herzl, Buber claims that the Jew was essentially Oriental. We're going to hear all about this a lot more today. Specifically, this Jewish Orientalism meant that contrary to the anti-Semitic trope, Jews were not a nomadic people, but ancestrally an agrarian society rooted in the soil. Exile in the Occident estranged them from their Asiatic ancestry. But Jews would be able to recover this ancestry and the particular creative activity associated with the Asiatic by returning to their homeland, a task whose urgency is put in sharp focus by the contemporary Asiatic crisis, in Buber's terms, by which Buber means European colonialism and imperialism in India, Persia, Japan, and also, of course, China. So we're going to hear more about this from Professor Agatha Bielek-Robson, who's sitting right there, later on, and also I'm going to touch upon this in my own paper. But let me note the peculiarity that Buber envisions in a recovery of an Asiatic principle of creative agency that is firstly opposed to both an Occidental view of its primitivism and passivity and an Occidental principle that, by contrast, is not genuinely creative in the sense Buber envisions. And secondly, moreover, is an Asiatic agency that is based in the agrarian and the ancestral. Now, I would certainly not be the first to suggest what I'm about to suggest, but it seems evident that the framework of Orientalism, as proposed by Edward Said, does not begin to encompass all of the various careers of the Oriental that I've just outlined. For in Said's description, Orientalism is, quote, a way of coming to terms with the Orient that is based on the Orient's special place in European Western experience, which is to say, as a colony, as a source of its image of its other, as a cultural contestant, all of which is also based in some kind of material culture. Orientalism makes, according to Said, the Orient because it could be submitted to being made Oriental. The relation between Occident and Orient is of unequal power and domination. And inasmuch as that power is real, Orientalism is not merely a mythic structure. But Said also sees Orientalism, quote, depending for its strategy on a flexible positional superiority that consistently grants the Westerner the relative upper hand. Since Said, of course, scholarship has uncovered a multitude of ways to complicate this picture, much in the vein of discerning other possible ideological positions and rhetorical strategies in the history of non-Asia's encounter with Asia. And for this, what might be considered post-colonial theory, that's just my trademark, whatever, has been illuminating and carving out a theoretical space for the kind of activity and thinking that sits askew to the relations between colonization and racialization as seen from a European or purely European point of view. To name just one example, Stephanie Newell has proposed the term paracolonial to describe readership networks in colonial West Africa that repurposed Anglophone literatures to articulate statements on their own modernity and authority. And Dilip Menon also has recently expanded on that term as well. My point in mentioning this is that the theoretical spaces carved out by neologisms like paracolonial can, as Newell points out, usefully displace the Eurocentric periodization of culture and history into pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial. Though more interesting for me is the fact that neologisms for these sorts of ill-fitting spaces keep getting invented, which seems to point out to opportunities the breakdown of fundamental categories of how one organizes work, coexistence, and continuing life. Here I'm going to very loosely paraphrase Marx via Benjamin, my best friend, and say that it's by and large in response to a crisis that philosophical production even begins. Hence the task of critical theory, to identify those moments where a concept emerges as concept because it has been deemed crisis-proof, and to reignite, therefore, the terms that made the crisis a genuine crisis in the first place. I realize I'm going off on a tangent now, but I will just mention one example from Marx himself, who with Engels began developing over a 30-year period a concept of a specific social totality that they called the Asiatic mode of production, which was in response to the increasing incorporation of Asia within capitalism and the problem that that posed to ideological notions of the relation of capitalism to non-capitalism. Marx never achieved his systematic exposition, but what interests me here is less the failure of the concept, if it was a failure, than the open question of the challenge that the attempt posed to the concept of capitalism. Like Buber, Marx and Engels too tried to set out distinctive features of the Oriental society, surveying India, the East Indies, Persia, and China. And Kafka, for his part, arguably reconstructs the collapse of categories as a temporal disjunction between a China whose culture is highly advanced yet technologically medieval, and in which imperial power struggles to take hold in the contemporary, except in symbols and gestures, and whose only available first-person viewpoint is evasive of attempts at universalization. This brings me to today's symposium. I'm very grateful that Dr. Daniel Weiss and Professor Agatha Bielik-Robson graciously accepted my invitation to speak today, and I'm very much looking forward to our discussion. So just as a note to how we're going to proceed, I'm going to introduce each speaker in turn, who will then give a presentation followed by some time for Q&A. after which we're going to have a roundtable discussion and then a general Q&A to conclude.